Hello, everybody. You're listening to the Polymath radio show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. Now, for those of you who are new here, this is an educational show, and it's unscripted, it's off the cuff, it's based on, I haven't revised it beforehand, it's based on stuff that I know already, and it's conversational. I want it to feel like I could just be talking to you in person. And today's episode is, what do left wing and right wing actually mean? And can we judge historical figures by the standards of today? And we're going to be exploring this question with some history, some political science, economics, psychology, and even when we deal with the nature of morality, and we will be, a bit of philosophy. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's just take a look at this question and just ask ourselves, where do these terms left wing and right wing actually come from? Because we accept them as a matter of course, but they are actually a bit odd. Left and right. Why is that even a thing? So left wing and right wing come from the French Revolution of 1789. And this is an event and a date which is going to be continually returned to in this podcast, or radio show, sorry. Dude, I keep saying podcast, damn. Radio show, just as we explore lots of different issues, because the French Revolution was such a pivotal event in world history. It's so important that it looms large in so many different questions and so many different subjects that we can tackle. And the French Revolution of 1789, modern politics, this kind of politics in the way that we can kind of recognize it now, with the ideas and the values that we can recognize now and that percolate in our society now. This is when all of that began. 1789 was the origin for all of that. And in the National Assembly, which was this legislative body that we see in the early stages of the French Revolution, that was comprised mainly of the middle class. The Ancien Regime supporters sat to the right of the President of the National Assembly, and revolutionaries sat to the left of the President of the National Assembly. You know what? I just want to specify that while the National Assembly was mainly comprised of the middle classes, it also had a few noblemen and a few clergymen as well. And I mention these three groups specifically because, and it ties in with an explanation of what the Ancien Regime actually is. So the Ancien Regime was this kind of feudal system of government in France that prevailed for centuries before, since the fall of the Roman Empire up until 1789. And in the Ancien Regime, society was organized into three classes. Also known as three estates. The first estate was the nobility? It may have been the clergy. The first estate was the clergy, yeah. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility, or the aristocracy. And the third estate was the people. Although in the kind of events of the National Assembly, the people was essentially just members of the middle classes. And in this, society was organized hierarchically, wherein the nobility and the clergy were politically unequal and superior to the people, and they had certain rights and privileges that the people didn't. Indeed, the whole point of the Ancien Regime was that the political system was based on privilege. It was based on certain people, i.e. noblemen and clergymen, having the unalienable right to be superior over other people in the system. And feudalism, as a political and economic system, is when society is structured into these classes and it's in a definite hierarchy. And the people below are legally subordinated to the people above in that hierarchy. That is a very simplistic explanation of two very complex phenomena. But for the purposes of this conversation, it does make sense. So, the supporters of the Ancien Regime in the National Assembly of the French Revolution in 1789 sat to the right of the president. And the revolutionaries, i.e. the people of the French Revolution, who were fighting for the values of, as the slogan goes, liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Excuse my terrible French accent. That is going to be a limitation in this. I'm sorry. Liberté, égalité, and fraternité, or freedom, equality, and brotherhood. The revolutionaries sat to the left of the President of the National Assembly. It's worth just noting that the idea of liberté, égalité, and fraternité it's quite vague, isn't it? I mean, I haven't really told you much about what that actually means. We're gonna get into the importance of the French Revolution in future episodes, and we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty of ideology and beliefs later in this episode. I'm just explaining to you some history for now. So, in subsequent assemblies gathered by the French Revolution, the idea of sitting to the left or the right is kind of solidified as a way of signifying your political belief. This persisted until 1784, when it was no longer like an official thing, where like if you had like a progressive belief, you had to sit to the left, and vice versa. But after 1794, the idea of left and right gradually came to be the terminology used to be like a political spectrum, i.e. this one-dimensional axis of political views ranging from different extremes, and the terms left and right have its origin in that kind of period. Now the spectrum, the kind of language of that spectrum in terms of left or right actually took a while to take hold colloquially. So after 1848, which is another really, really important date in European history because it saw a wave of democratic left-wing revolutions that swept the whole continent, the language of 1848 wasn't left or right. It was democratic socialists or Democrats versus reactionaries. That was the language used. Whereas a reactionary, by the way, is just, it can sort of be seen as an extreme conservative, somebody who really wants to preserve the status quo and resists any kind of change to the established political, economic, or socio-cultural order. The meanings of democracy and socialism we're going to get into later. However, left-right as this kind of explicit way of ordering the political spectrum, i.e. the range of political views that we see in human societies, that spread after 1871, a date in history where the Third Republic was established in France, as well as some other stuff, of course. And then France as this kind of nucleus of the terms left and right, the terms left and right spread from that nucleus to the rest of Europe and then eventually the rest of the world. France as a nucleus of modern politics, by the way, is quite, I mean, we tend to see France now as just like, you know, they're just there, they're chilling, they got nice food, they got funny accents. But actually in 1789, with the French Revolution, France gained this massive, massive political significance as the center point, as the epicenter of this huge, humongous change in not just politics, but in the way that people thought, in the social values that people held, and the political psychology that pervaded the nations of Europe. France was the center point of this massive explosion in 1789. And in the subsequent century, in the 1800s, France retained a lot of that ideological centricity. The point which is really important to make here is that left and right are used as relative terms and not absolute ideologies. Because, I mean, I've just told you, for example, that in the National Assembly, the supporters of the Ancien Regime sat to the right of the president. But the modern right wing in France does not support feudalism or the Ancien Regime. That is just clearly ridiculous. What I'm trying to say is that what has been considered left, right, or center has changed throughout history and place. These are relative terms that need to be kind of contextualized and conceptualized in relation to each other. So different ideologies can therefore be considered left or right depending on their relation to others. An example is democracy. In the French Revolution in 1789, the idea of democracy, the idea of a people controlling the government and holding political power was a genuinely revolutionary, amazing idea. It was something that would have been seen undoubtedly as left-wing, probably as far left, depending on the degree of democracy. Democracy, by the way, can include every man or woman over the age of 18. It can include every man over the age of 18. It can include every man over the age of 18 who has a certain amount of money or property. These are all definitions of democracy that have applied in European societies throughout history. So, actually, when we say democracy in 1789 was a far left or left-wing ideology, it depends on the extent of democracy that you're talking about here. The point is that while democracy in 1789 was this revolutionary new idea which broke out onto the continent and forever changed the kind of ideological landscape of the world, nowadays democracy is standard. It's no longer this revolutionary idea in Western Europe. Obviously there are countries which aren't democratic, but they're seen as right-wing. Democracy is very much seen as the norm now in the developed world. So democracy, kind of in its modern iteration in Western Europe, it's just a normative, centrist belief. It's just standard. This is what I mean. The same kind of set of beliefs, the same ideology shifts on the left-right spectrum depending on what is seen as normal at the time. Left and right are relative terms. Now, I've used this word ideology before. What is an ideology? So an ideology we can think of as a set of values, beliefs, and policies. But these differ wildly in precision. For example, Socialism is an ideology, but it's a massive umbrella term. It is so many different potential definitions and interpretations. There have been so many different socialist countries in history. There have been so many different socialist theorists, all advocating for actually quite different things and different ideals and different beliefs throughout history. A slightly narrower ideology is Marxism, which is a specific form of socialism, kind of based around the theories of Marx and the kind of beliefs of Marx. But even here, Marxism is notoriously quite ambiguous. You can interpret Marx in lots of different ways. There's also the fact that things which have been in no rational way Marxism have often been identified as Marxism. So, for example, the Soviet Union, or indeed any socialist country that we have seen in global history, the USSR, China, Cuba, Vietnam, whatever, they claim to be Marxist, or they claim to be socialist, but actually if you look at their beliefs, if you look at their values, if you look at their actual policies, they're anything but. The point is that ideologies are difficult because they're not necessarily one certain thing. There's always a range of interpretations and opinions, and even then, the situation is doubly complicated by the fact that you can do things in the name of an ideology, whilst actually in practice supporting an ideology that is completely different. Stalinism, the values, beliefs, and policies associated with Joseph Stalin, are completely different from Marxism, the values, beliefs, and policies associated with Karl Marx. And that is something we'll talk about in future episodes. I'm not going to elaborate on that here, but it's just a really important point to note. So, democracy, as I mentioned earlier, can, in fact, be thought of as an ideology. But I think another, and perhaps a better way to conceptualize it, is as a system of power. I.e., how is political power, i.e., how is the ability to do things in society, how is that power distributed within that society? Now, democracy, the word comes from actually ancient Greek words, which is important because democracy, as we know it, initiated in ancient Greece. Demos is the Greek word for people, and krasi comes from the Greek word kratos, which means strength or power. So democracy literally means power of the people. Aristocracy, in contrast, comes from the words aristo, which means best, and krasi, which comes from the word kratos, which means power. Best, in this case, meaning a small, narrow elite of people who are deemed to be superior in some other way to the masses. So aristocracy is ruled by a narrow elite who are legally and culturally seen as superior to the masses. But we also have lots of other forms of power systems. For example, autocracy, which is the rule of one person, auto being the Greek word for self. And then we have all kinds of variants that you can find in political science texts on Wikipedia, such as craterocracy, kleptocracy, straightocracy, newocracy, timocracy, plutocracy. Plutocracy being, I'm going to define plutocracy specifically, so it is actually quite relevant, the rule of wealth, i.e. the fact that the wealthiest people in society hold political power. But what's important is within each system of power, so for example, democracy, that can occupy wildly different points on the left-right spectrum, and indeed encompasses a range of ideologies. So for example, you can have capitalistic democracy. You can have the kind of liberal democracy that we see in Western Europe nowadays. Liberalism, I'm going to explain, the meaning of the word liberal, I'm also going to explain. We have liberal democracy that we see in Western Europe. You have social democracy. Actually, let me just explain that. Liberal democracy of the kind that prevailed in Western Europe in the 1800s, wherein there was political equality, but there was, or at least, there was political equality as in people who owned a certain amount of property in Western European countries would be given a vote in the 1800s. From about I forget the specific date, but just after World War I, when universal suffrage was adopted in Western European countries, but in the interwar period, there still wasn't that much provision of social security or social welfare. Trade unions still didn't occupy an officially it was maybe a bit of a more dubious position occupied by trade unions in society, where they may have been seen as subversive or looked down upon by members of government. And then after World War II, we see the adoption of social democracy, which is a democratic system in which there's widespread welfare measures, redistributive taxation, and a role for working class bodies such as trade unions. Also, there's a form of democracy called democratic socialism, which is the economic system of socialism paired with the power structure of democracy. What I'm trying to say is that all of these different ideologies, i.e. the liberal democracy we see in the mid-1800s, where poor people were sent to the workhouses and people without a house couldn't vote, is very different from the kind of democracy that we saw in the 1950s. So, power systems are not the same as ideologies. This also brings us to economic systems, such as capitalism, socialism, and communism. Now, of course, these are also to some extent political systems, and also ideologies in and of themselves, such as socialism. I'm just trying to make a point that something like democracy, a political system, is distinct technically, even though it often accompanies it, from an economic system such as capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system wherein the means of production are owned privately, so by private individuals, for the production of profit. The means of production is just how are things made or done in society. So a factory is a means of production. A farm is a means of production. Something like that. Socialism is when the means of production are owned publicly, i.e. by the people kind of in general. An example would be a bunch of workers working in a factory and all of them own shares or stakes in that factory. And the factory is owned collectively by the people working in the factory. Communism is an economic system where the means of production are owned publicly, but also the products of that, the things that are produced, are distributed publicly, i.e. there is state government control. But when I say government, the idea of communism is meant to be that it's the people who are the government, i.e. the state as a foreign structure imposed on people withers away, and in fact the people of that country become the government. They all have a share in it. Communism is when goods are distributed by the people or the government or the state as well. But I say state in that libertarian sense. Just as an important note, communism, and as seen in, say, the Soviet Union, deviates quite far from this reality, especially in that the communism of the Soviet Union, or indeed in other socialist states that we see in the 20th century, the government or the state is not in fact the embodiment of the people, and there is no such thing as this kind of foreign apparatus of the state which is imposed on people. In fact, the state in the Soviet Union was a rigidly oppressive polity, and indeed the people did not own the means of production, and they did not control the distribution of the things that were produced. That was controlled by the Communist Party. So the economic system of socialism and communism, as kind of understood technically, was not actually practiced by the Soviet Union. Anyway, there are in fact other economic beliefs as well. For example, central planning, which was what was practiced by the Soviet Union and many socialist countries, which is basically when there's no market as such, people don't buy or sell things. The state determines what gets made, when it gets made, where it gets made, and how these products are distributed. What I'm trying to say is that these economic beliefs and economic systems of power and political systems of power have some measure of objectivity. They are sets of beliefs. They are ideologies. Unlike left or right, which is just very relative terms. Even if something like democracy is really variable and in fact covers a huge range of positions, it's still more definite an idea than just left. Because what's left depends on what's right, whereas democracy is an actual system in and of itself. So this begs the question, where on the political spectrum have all of these systems of power and ideologies been located? And in order to kind of understand leftism and rightism and what that all means today, it's really helpful to look at this from a historical perspective and kind of think to ourselves, okay, throughout history, what does leftism come to mean? What does rightism come to mean? And what of these different systems and beliefs that we've just described, how do they correlate to that political spectrum? So, historically, in the period of 1789 from the French Revolution to around the mid-1800s, and that date of 1789 is a bit of an oversimplification because in fact the beliefs of the French Revolution have their roots in preceding periods, namely a period called the Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s, which was this kind of huge change in political and social cultural thought that we see in Europe. But anyway, that's a topic that we're going to get into a little bit later. I just want to make the point that I'm about to make right now. Historically, in the period of 1789 to around the mid-1800s, the meaning of leftism was about civil liberties, such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, so i.e. being able to meet up with a bunch of people in large groups without the government shutting you down for fear of political subversion, the freedom to practice the religion that you want to practice. It's also about the freedom to start any newspapers that you want and print whatever you want to print on those newspapers. Leftism was about political rights and freedoms. It was about the freedom of being arrested for no reason or abducted for no reason. The right to not be tortured, for example. The right to not have your property or your homes confiscated at will by some government or nobleman who could just do whatever they want. It was about protection from force in society. It was basically about saying that just because a nobleman or a monarch is stronger than you and can levy more force, that doesn't mean that they have the right to do whatever they want to do. You, in fact, have certain rights as an individual that determine how you have to be treated. Leftism was about legal equality. It was about all people in society being seen in the eyes of the law as the same as one another, in stark contrast to the overwhelming majority of human history since civilization began in 4000 BCE, where people have not been legally equal, and small elites in societies have had huge privileges that the masses haven't, and where in many societies, for example, I'm just going to give an example, in ancient Babylon, the law code of Hammurabi prescribed that the penalty for, say, attacking a nobleman was higher than attacking a common person, for example. That's just an example of legal inequality that I'm trying to give. Back to 1789 to the mid-1800s, leftism was about secularism. It was about the church not having influence in politics and not being able to control the state. And leftism was about some degree of democracy, and the degree of democracy which leftism was about depended on how far left you were at the time. In the French Revolution, the farthest left, a group of people called the Jacobins, supported... Actually, the Jacobins weren't really democratic, to be honest, but the Jacobins, at least nominally or initially, supported a democracy wherein all males could vote. Whereas other factions, for example, the Girondins, supported a more limited democracy where you had to own a certain amount of property to be able to vote. So what was rightism about in this same period? It was in support of aristocracy, in feudalism, in the idea of privilege, that people who are at the top of the system have a right to be at the top of that system and have a right to exercise the privileges that come with that. It was about authority and the obedience of authority. It was about the power of the church and the kind of spiritual authority, but also the material wealth and political power of that church. It was, in short, about preserving the status quo, whereas leftism was about changing the status quo. And the class struggle that we see here, and I say class struggle not because I'm taking a Marxist perspective of history, but because it is clear that there were definitive social groups that generally tended to go for one side of this political spectrum. Generally, on the right, we see the aristocracy and the clergy. And on the left, we see the bourgeoisie, i.e. the middle classes of society, and the kind of great masses, the people, on the other. On the left, in this era, was the ideology of liberalism. What is the ideology of liberalism? Liberalism is this kind of political, economic, and socio-cultural ideology that developed in Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, primarily in, as I said, the Age of Enlightenment, which again was this period in the 1700s where people suddenly began questioning the norms of society very severely. And liberalism fundamentally is about private property, people having the right to own things, and the government or the nobility not being able to take that away. It's about rule of law, i.e. even the monarch, even the most powerful people in society, having to obey the law and stay within the limits of the law. The idea that power comes from the law rather than just one guy at the top doing whatever they want to do and exercising their power arbitrarily. Liberalism is about the separation of church and state, so i.e. not allowing religion to have a role in politics. It's about the values of science and rationalism, i.e. the use of reason and the application of reason and criticism and skepticism to politics, rather than previous notions of tradition, authority, and feudalism. And liberalism is about political equality, i.e. people being equal, and about every person having an equal right to be happy. And the idea of a right to happiness is something I'm going to talk more about in another episode based on the French Revolution. But just to let you know, for the vast majority of human history, the prevailing social and political psychology at the time has been that people have not had an equal right to happiness, and that your right to be happy depends on your socioeconomic station. Now, the ideology of liberalism, as you've probably noticed, is now the dominant ideology in Western society. And it's fun actually because in America, people identify as liberals or conservatives, but in fact, liberalism, as the political scientific definition, is prevalent in almost all minds of Americans. It's only very few Americans who consciously reject liberalism. So, for example, American fascists. It also gives rise to the term liberal democracy, which is a democracy based on the premises of liberalism. However, the actual nature of liberal democracy has changed quite a lot throughout history. We're going to explore that in a bit. As I was saying, in the period of 1789 to the mid-1800s, leftism was about the ideology of liberalism, the political system of democracy, even if the degree of democracy was in debate, and the economic system of capitalism. On the right were the ideologies of feudalism, i.e. a way of structuring society in according to hierarchical relationships where those at the bottom of society are legally inferior to those at the top. Feudalism also implies it's an economic system as well as a political system, wherein in feudalism, instead of economic relationships being characterized by buying, selling, and the market and money and profit, it's categorized in terms of services. So, for example, a peasant owes the services to his lord of fealty and obedience, and also of labor to the lord. So, a peasant has to work on the lord's fields without being compensated in some way for a certain number of days a week. A peasant also has the duty that has to owe military service to the lord. So when the peasant is summoned to war, they have to obey. In return, the lord gives the services of justice, i.e. in arbitrating disputes between peasants. It's very important to add that a lord is not going to provide justice when it comes to the lord abusing their own power, and also provides protection, i.e. from some other force or some kind of hostile army or band or group of criminals from attacking that peasant. The point is that it's about services, and indeed the relationship between a lord and king is also characterized by services and duty, wherein the lord is a vassal of the king, i.e. the lord owes the king services of a bit of obedience, perhaps taxation, although historically nobles have been exempt from taxation in various ways. That, by the way, was a major cause of the French Revolution. And in return, and also military service, and in return, the king gives them judicial arbitration and protection, i.e. military protection. So, as the 1800s wore on, power passed in Western Europe from the aristocracy to the bourgeoisie, i.e. the wealthy middle classes, and increasingly in Western Europe, starting with, for example, in Britain, the 1832 Reform Act, which gave the vote to the upper middle classes. We see this process in the 1800s of the levers of power, which had previously been held purely by this kind of old feudal aristocracy, growingly come to be held and indeed dominated towards the end of that century by the bourgeoisie, this historical class kind of defined as capitalists subscribing to the ideology of liberalism who are people of means and wealth. And as the political situation changed, the meaning of left and right changed. Obviously for other reasons than the bourgeoisie taking over the levers of power. Obviously, the 1800s saw the greatest concentration of human change in history, and with that change just comes political and socio-cultural and ideological change in general, and the meanings of left and right are bound to change in that context, because left and right, remember, are relative terms. And they're relative to the accepted norms and kind of centrist normative beliefs of society at the time. So in the late 1800s, leftism became about economic rather than political equality, i.e., for example, a welfare state, which had pensions, unemployment benefits, sick pay, strong regulations for capitalists, regulations for the amount of hours that people could work, paid holiday, etc. It also became about redistributive taxes, for example, taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor by means of taxation and public services. Leftism also became about progressive values when it came to both race and gender, of which I'm going to be talking about those in a little bit later. It also became about internationalism and about the idea of the working classes of different countries should cooperate rather than fight each other, about rejecting nationalism and turning to a kind of international class consciousness wherein the nations were united. Rightism in this period, it became about the inviolability of private property. It became about laissez-faire economics, i.e. not regulating the economy, not providing any welfare or redistributive taxation or anything like that. And it became about nationalism, racial values, i.e. scientific racist values, which proposed that Western Europeans or Europeans were scientifically superior to other races. And it also and rightism in this period was also about traditional gender roles. For example, women not being able to have property or not being able to have political rights, etc., etc. So, in this period, however, in the late 1800s, whereas liberalism had been this left-wing belief in the late 1700s that was fought for by the bourgeoisie and the masses, now, in the late 1800s, liberalism was the central normative belief. I.e., what do I mean by the normative belief? It was the commonly accepted baseline view of society. And instead of the left-wing ideology that was most dominant in this period was not liberalism, but was in fact socialism. And socialism grew from the intellectual heritage of liberalism. It was still about rule of law. It was still about freedom and equality, and it still aspired to these values. But socialism's conception of freedom and equality wasn't just about political equality, it was about economic equality as well. Liberalism says we want all men to be equal, so we're going to give everyone civil liberties, we're going to let them say what they want and do what they want, and we're going to just leave them to it. Socialism says this situation has not led to true freedom or equality, and for actual freedom and equality, different policies are needed. Namely, the kind of public ownership of the means of production. Although, of course, socialism is a massive umbrella term with a huge number of definitions. That idea of socialism being public ownership of the means of production is just like a one-sentence political science summary. The meanings of the ideologies of liberalism and socialism I'm going to explore in future episodes. Anyway, the right-wing ideologies in the late 1800s were kind of the old-school feudal reactionary beliefs, the kind of aristocratic, reactionary, monarchist, those kinds of values, i.e. the rejection of liberalism as it has evolved. We also see on the right during the late 1800s this kind of proto-fascism, these movements of a new kind of right, one which was beginning to also reject the heritage of liberalism, and one which was based on some extent in indeed economic equality and welfare and redistribution, but on deeply conservative social, cultural and political values. So i.e. being against democracy, being against the emancipation of women, being against racial equality, being against kind of internationalism and being staunchly nationalist, and in its later forms, glorifying violence and seeing violence as an end in itself rather than a means to an end. An example of this proto-fascism that we see emerging in the late 1800s is the French party Action Française, which I'm not going to talk about too much now, but I welcome you to look it up. They were basically just a far-right group in the late 1800s, which was virulent and inflammatory even for the time. I mean, a lot of their politics was just being deeply hateful to other groups and encouraging violence. Anyway, what do we notice in these historical trends? That was just this kind of brief enunciation of leftism and rightism until like the late 1800s / the post-World War I era, where they begin to take a slightly more recognizable form and where we begin to kind of see the current ideologies, or at least not the current, more contemporary ideologies of fascism, communism, and social democracy. Or rather, democracy in Western Europe where there is a universal suffrage. So, as we can see, throughout this period from the French Revolution, and then in that 100 years where society and politics changed so drastically, leftism has historically been, as we can see, a progressive ideology championed by and favouring those who have been excluded from power. Whereas rightism has been a more conservative ideology based on preserving the status quo and preventing political, economic, or socio-cultural change, and tending to be championed by and favouring those who are already in some form of power. And these insights and historical progress of the political spectrum are all relevant to understanding it today. And I know it's been half an hour, and I still haven't really addressed leftism and rightism in the modern sense. But I think it's just really important and really helpful, and hopefully really interesting. I do hope you guys find it interesting, genuinely. It's to kind of understanding leftism and rightism today. So, what do we think of today when we hear the word left? What is leftism associated with? So the values, the policies, and the associations of leftism tend to be freedom and equality. Freedom and equality are the kind of basic foundations of leftism. And these can be interpreted in very different ways, but it's fairly undeniable that these values kind of constitute what we mean by left and what leftists want. And also the idea of people having rights, the idea of progress, the idea of changing the status quo, the idea of reform in some sense, of internationalism, of being pro-immigration in this case, of multiculturalism, of economic redistribution, of welfare policies, of green policies, of redistributional taxation, of trans rights, of veganism, etc., etc., etc. A huge range of policies and values and beliefs. And people tend to have some kind of conception that the Labour Party is left and say the Conservative Party is right. Actually, I'm going to get on to addressing that in a minute. Let's just talk about what people think about today when they think of the word right. So what values is rightism associated with? It's associated with the value of authority, of order, of stability, of loyalty, of tradition, of duty, of hierarchy, of the status quo, of resisting the changes that people see today as undesirable in some sort. And of course, the opposite of the policies of being pro-immigration, being multicultural, of supporting, of being, for example, progressive in LGBT values, etc., etc., etc. And out of these differing values, we get different political positions and policies. And people nowadays have some kind of conception that, as I said, the Labour Party is vaguely left-wing, and the Conservative Party is vaguely right-wing, and UKIP is further right, and fascism is really, really far right, and communism is really, really far left. And what's interesting in the political spectrum is that actually the far left and the far right, communism and fascism, tend to actually be quite fundamentally similar in some way. Almost as if the political spectrum, instead of being a line, is like a horseshoe where the extremes once again converge. In America, we look at the Republican and Democratic Party, and we can clearly see the Democratic Party is further left than the Republican Party, even if, in terms of the actual views of Democrats or Republicans, relative to the modern Western political spectrum, both of these parties are actually quite right-wing. In the case of the Republican Party, very right-wing. But the point that I'm trying to say here is, leftism and rightism, I've just thrown at you this huge range of values and policies and associations and beliefs. What do we do with this massive kind of I was about to say hodgepodge, but it just feels very Victorian. It feels like I'm just some 1800s man next to a fireplace saying, "Oh, humbug, hodgepodge." I don't want to say hodgepodge, but it is a good word. Screw it. Hodgepodge of ideas. Out of this massive hodgepodge of ideas, what am I doing? This massive hodgepodge of ideas, we can kind of extract three strands. We can look at three categories. We can look at political values, i.e., how should political power be distributed? How strong should the government be? What should the government be able to do? What should they not do? What are the kind of beliefs on freedom that we hold in society? We can extract a strand of economic values, which is how should the government manage the economy? What should the aims of managing the economy be, if it is managed? And what should the government's relationship to the economy be? And we can also extract this kind of strand of socio-cultural values. So people's views on, for example, abortion, or euthanasia, or religion, or the role of religion, or the role of tradition, or LGBT rights, or veganism, etc., etc., etc. So from this, we can look at this kind of big one-dimensional axis of the political spectrum, and we can break it down into three separate axes. Because actually, that big one-dimensional axis of the political spectrum, that's very reductive. Think about how difficult it is to try and encapsulate the huge range of political opinion which we see in the world and somehow map that onto a single axis. It's very difficult. I'm going to be talking about three axes here, which we can kind of distill the differences and divergences in political beliefs to. One of them is the libertarian/authoritarian axis, i.e., how much power should the government have, and who is in control of that government, and how does the machinery of that government work? So libertarianism is basically the belief that government should not have much control over a citizen's daily life. Authoritarianism is the belief that the government should have more control over a citizen's daily life. Totalitarianism is the belief that the government should have complete control over a citizen's daily life. And it goes without saying that aristocracy or autocracy, for example, is a more authoritarian system than oligarchy, which is ruled by a few people. Archos being the Greek word for rule, oligo being the Greek prefix for few, and the oligarchy is more authoritarian than democracy. The more widely political power is distributed, the more people who hold political power, generally, the more libertarian a society becomes. And an example of a libertarian belief would be, for example, freedom of speech, freedom to form trade unions, freedom to form different political parties. Authoritarian beliefs would be, the opposite, first of all. Also, authoritarian beliefs like national surveillance, like the idea of being able to see what a citizen is looking up on their phone and being able to track where they're going by using their phone. Cough, cough, USA. So libertarian authoritarian is one kind of axis of political thought which we can map political beliefs onto. Another axis is economic leftism versus economic rightism. That's a bit confusing because we've been referring to leftism and rightism as these two parts of a one-dimensional political spectrum. But we can also look at economic leftism and economic rightism specifically as one of the many axes which comprise this huge political left-right spectrum. And economic leftism is essentially belief in that the government should intervene in the economy more. Economic rightism is the belief that the government should be intervening in the economy less. So laissez-faire, for example, is a very economically right-wing ideology, which basically means that the government shouldn't intervene in the economy at all. An extremely far economic right belief is minarchism, which is that the government should provide only, I think, law courts, a military, and a police, and nothing else. Not even infrastructure. Most people disagree with that. And something like unemployment benefits, social security, trade unions, a progressive income tax, an income tax in general. All these are more economically left policies. And at the far economic left, we have central planning, which is when the government decides what gets made and who gets what's made. There is no market at all, i.e. society is not comprised of people who are able to buy and sell things for profit. That doesn't exist. Central planning is when there is no market and the government controls all of that production and distribution. But these are just some examples here. There's a massive multiplicity of beliefs all across both of these spectra that we've just described. Now, the third axis that I want to talk about is the idea of progressive versus conservative. It's a social cultural axis based on what your cultural values are. So, for example, a progressive stance on trans rights, veganism, homophobia, feminism, anti-racism can be seen as progressive, and then obviously more conservative stances are just that, more conservative. I mean, the Black Lives Matter protests were progressive protests. The police opposing them, or the members of American society saying Blue Lives Matter, were conservative forces socioculturally. Those who are in support of third wave feminism can be considered progressive. Those who are against it can be considered conservative. Except that's what I'm trying to say. Progressive and conservative, just the social and the cultural beliefs that an individual holds. Now here's the thing, what is considered to be libertarian or economic left or progressive changes throughout time. So for example, most people nowadays would say that racism is wrong. This is not a progressive or a conservative belief, it's a normative belief. It's a standard belief held by society, at least in the Western world. But historically, the idea that racism is wrong has been a progressive belief. It has not been a normative belief. But even though what is considered progressive or conservative changes throughout time, an objective policy, for example, the policy of, let's say, unemployment benefits being a thing, that's a policy that holds a definite kind of political position. Even if the left-right political spectrum shifts, and even if that one policy on, say, unemployment benefits is considered left-wing or centrist or right-wing, depending on the context of the time. As a policy, it is objective. Let's say we consider the economic left, right spectrum to be graded in terms of 1 to 10. Grade 1 is central planning, grade 10 is minarchism. And then grade 5, let's say, is roughly akin to the society we have now after Thatcher and Reagan, and the political economic philosophy of neoliberalism, which these people inaugurated and kind of became the prophets of. Let's say that 5 in this numerical spectrum that we've created is the society that we have now, the status quo. Now, obviously, as society changes, the kind of political spectrum, the belief that is seen as normative might jump from 5 to 4 to 3 to 6 to 7, etc., etc. What's seen as progressive may be a 5 in one era, or a 7 in another era, and a 3 in one era. The point is that a policy, i.e. the policy of minarchism, is objectively far economic right, and always, if we're going to use this numerical spectrum that I've just set up here, actually it's not a numerical spectrum, because the spectrum doesn't consist of discrete values. If we can take this numerical scale here, minarchism is always going to be a 10 on that scale. That's what I'm trying to say. So we have these spectra, these 3 separate axes: libertarian, authoritarian, economic left, economic right, progressive and conservative, and then we can place ideologies and beliefs on where they rank on these spectra, which is what I was trying to demonstrate with that whole 1 to 10 experiment earlier. So, for example, people often have this intuition that far left and far right actually kind of converge in an important way. So the communism that we see in the Soviet Union had this fundamental similarity with the fascism of Nazi Germany or Italy. And we can use these 3 axes to unravel how that may be the case. So we can see that the similarity between Soviet Union, the communism that we see in the Soviet Union, perhaps we can call this Stalinism, the values, beliefs, and practices associated with Stalin, even though the Soviet Union wasn't always Stalinist. But let's say we take a snapshot of the 1930s and we have Stalinism and fascism. Both Stalinism and fascism are totalitarian. So on the libertarian authoritarian axis, they're on the far right. Stalinism on the economic axis is to the far economic left. Fascism on the economic axis is actually quite centrist, because fascism kind of, Hitler and Mussolini, for example, classically cooperated with big business and indeed mobilized the support of big business and the middle classes by appealing to their fears of communism or socialism. In fact, some of the most ardent supporters of fascism in Germany and Italy during this period were actually the lower middle class, or what we could call the petty bourgeoisie. So, for example, shopkeepers, lower office workers, clerks, school teachers, things like that. It was among these social classes that fascism actually had the greatest appeal. And in terms of the progressive conservative axis, Stalinism was, it claimed to be inheriting this massive, mega progressive tradition of Marx and socialism. It actually wasn't. It was a complete bastardization of that tradition. But still, in terms of its values, social cultural values, for example, regarding abortion and the role of women, it was maybe centrist / on the progressive side. I would say probably more on the progressive side. Whereas, of course, fascism was extremely conservative. It was hyper-conservative. In fact, fascism is characterized by this extreme conservatism, this massive rejection of social progress and moral progress, and indeed a rejection of liberalism and all the meanings of that which I just discussed earlier as a whole. Now, of course, all the different ideologies, we could spend a year discussing all of them. Well, not a year. That's probably a bit much, unless you're like a serial yapper. But I just mean we could spend a long time. But further discussion of all the different ideologies and what these actually are is going to come in future episodes. Now, if you look at a political or an economic system, for example, capitalism or democracy, there's a bit more variation in where they can lie on these 3 axes, but they still track on these 3 axes to some extent. So, for example, capitalism on the economic left-right spectrum, it encompasses quite a wide range, but you know it's not going to be on the far economic left. So on that spectrum, capitalism, let's say we return to that number example that we did earlier of 1 to 10, of 1 being central planning, 10 being minarchism. Capitalism would be like a 3 to 10, let's say, or a 4 to 10. We could also use the example of democracy. Democracy can be implemented in a huge number of different ways. But it's safe to say that highly authoritarian state is not going to be a democracy. The nature of democracy, as long as a country is an actual democracy and not just a democracy by name, cough cough Soviet Union, it's always going to be libertarian to some extent. So we can kind of see these three axes, and we can diffract this left-right political spectrum into three axes, and we can test people's beliefs. We can track people's beliefs, so let's say an individual's beliefs on this left-right spectrum, but we can also probably more accurately track their beliefs on this kind of spectrum of libertarian / authoritarian, economic left / economic right, or progressive / conservative. And the three axes that I've just named here aren't law. There's a humongous number of ways that the traditional left-right spectrum has been diffracted and broken down and categorized. I mean, if you go on the Wikipedia page for political spectrum, you get a huge number of ideas for these. And, you know, I was going to do in this one talk, what the left wing and right wing actually mean, and can we judge historical figures by the standard of today? But it's already been 50 minutes. I mean, I might separate this, actually, into two distinct episodes, one of which being what we've just covered, and the other one being judging historical figures by the values of today. Yeah, I'm gonna see. I'm not sure how long that's gonna take, though, is the only thing. Oh, I don't know. But anyway, the final point that I do just want to make, if I do choose to cut this episode off here, I think a final important point is that the field of political psychology, the academic discipline called political psychology, attempts to connect people's political beliefs, i.e. where they track on these three different axes. And again, these three axes are just examples of my own creation. Not actually my own creation. I didn't come up with them, of course. I just mean they're the ones that I have incorporated into my own belief system and my own way of characterizing political views. There are other ways to do this. But political psychology attempts to connect people's political beliefs with the moral values that they hold, and the moral values that they hold with psychological and neurobiological phenomena. And I touched upon this very briefly in episode 5 of Polymath, where I was talking about the genetic roots of morality, and I touched on the moral foundations theory of the fantastic Jonathan Haidt, and I also touched a bit upon neurobiology. I mean, political psychology is really a talk for another time, and I think it's something that I will save for another time. But I just want to bring the attention to the fact that the political beliefs that people hold are based on differing moral values that they hold, and on differing proportions of importance that they assign between these moral values. So, for example, leftism tends to be based, for example, on the moral value of empathy, of caring for the suffering of others and seeking to alleviate it. Rightism in the Western world tends to be based more on the moral value of proportionality, of i.e. people reaping what they sow and handouts not being given to people who don't deserve them or haven't worked for them. The idea being that people get their just desserts and that the attribution of material resources and reward is fair, i.e. is proportional to the amount of work that people are putting in. Hence the outcry on the right of welfare queens and the opposition to benefits and social security payments, because these are perceived as unfair in that they're perceived as people who are not working gaining material reward for not doing so, even whilst other citizens work and perhaps have a lower standard of living. I'm not saying I agree with that viewpoint, but I'm just saying that the political beliefs of rightism make much, much more sense when viewed through this lens, i.e. in the pursuit and the promotion of a definitive moral value. And of course, empathy and proportionality are not the only moral values that political beliefs are based in. I mean, other ones, for example, include equality, i.e. the idea of people occupying it's a little bit self-explanatory, being equal. The idea of fair treatment of people in that, fairness can be construed as proportionality or equality. Fairness can be construed as proportionality, wherein people get what they sow, people reap what they sow, which is often the interpretation held by the political right, or the word fairness can be interpreted as equality, i.e. people being treated the same and being able to have the same kind of rights and experience, and particularly economic equality, wherein people have equality of opportunity and equality of circumstances and equality of environment. And that definition of fairness tends to be associated with the political left. Another moral value is loyalty. People do tend to value loyalty quite uniformly, but the right in modern Western politics seems to value loyalty much more, in that, for example, questioning one's country or being overtly anti-patriotic is seen more as a political sin, whereas to leftists, it isn't seen as a moral violation at all. The idea of obedience and deference to authority is also a moral value, again, almost exclusively held by the political right. To try and conceptualize this for a leftist, because the idea of authority doesn't really track to leftist moral values at all in modern society, you could say, for example, that a good parent should have authority over a child, and it is moral for the child to recognize the authority of the parent. Political rightism tends to apply that moral value to politics, whereas political leftism tends to do the exact opposite, and indeed has quite an anti-authority streak. And finally, a moral value is sanctity, which again is almost exclusively the province of the political right, wherein we see, for example, political rightists being outraged at stamping on the flag or burning the flag or disrespecting the symbols of America, for example. Again, in leftism, sanctity as a moral value doesn't really have any parallel, which may lead you, if you are a leftist, to consider that sanctity isn't a moral value. However, first of all, we see the idea of sanctity as a moral value in religion since time immemorial. The idea of something being ritually pure or ritually clean or ritually unclean or ritually impure, for example, kosher or treif, halal or haram, etc., etc. This is just the standard language of religions for most of human history. All of that is rooted in the moral value of sanctity. Another explanation of the moral value of sanctity can be seen in something such as incest. Whereas if you propose the ethical scenario to someone of two consenting adults committing incest and not regretting that decision, and indeed feeling that it's brought them closer but deciding not to do that again, most people will say that such a scenario is inherently morally wrong. But when questioned to explain why it's morally wrong, they suddenly flounder because they can't say, well, it harms other people or it harms themselves, because it's just two consenting adults who haven't felt like they've been harmed from it. The reason why people say that this is morally wrong is because it violates the moral value of sanctity, i.e. something that just shouldn't be done. It's just disgusting in a moral sense. It provokes a moral kind of disgust. I'm aware that this is quite a significant digression. We were talking about leftism and rightism, and now I'm hitting you with incest. I always feel like I should apologize. But it's a relevant point here, because the point that I'm trying to make is that moral values are routinely applied by individuals to politics and political beliefs. And indeed, the moral values which people hold dear and the priority that they give to different moral values is a huge, perhaps one of the primary, if not the primary determinant of the political beliefs they hold, and therefore where they lie on those political spectra. Now, I was going to talk about can we judge historical figures by the standards of today, but actually, it seems we're out of time. I could go over an hour, but I think what would probably be more appropriate is if I saved it for a future episode, because in fact, there's a lot to say on this topic. It's quite an important topic, which I think has quite topical relevance for a lot of people, because we find ourselves in an era where we are in fact looking very critically on figures of the past. For example, Edward Colston or Winston Churchill or the Founding Fathers or Christopher Columbus. And we are in fact evaluating historical figures by standards of today, or at least we are now starting to evaluate historical figures morally in a way that we haven't really been doing much before. So I think it's actually a very relevant topic to talk about, which maybe should be given its own episode. And I think that's actually what I'm going to do. So in that case, I'm going to leave this off here. I'm going to continue this another time. I already have the kind of bullet point plan for the Can We Judge Historical Figures by the Standards of Today episode sketched out. So I know what I'm going to say for it. It's going to link in with this one quite heavily. So until then, I wish you all the very best. If there's anyone listening until this point, which I'm skeptical of, but I would be very honored if someone was, then again, I'm flattered and honored. Anyone who's listening at all, in fact, I'm flattered and honored by. It really means a lot to me. So I wish you all the best, whoever is listening. And I hope you have a lovely day. Take care. And thank you very much for listening again.